Hello everyone and welcome to the 21st episode of Viral Banter. Today's episode is a budget special and we are very, very privileged to have a group of economic specialists on the show because I am not very good at economics, unfortunately. But we are joined by four amazing guests who are going to talk me through this budget and explain if we are indeed all doomed. But let's start with a familiar face. He is a campus coordinator at UQ. Please welcome Ryan.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thank you for being on the show again, Ryan. And another campus coordinator, he is our favorite medical student at Monash University. Please welcome Peumike.
Thanks for having me back on, Renee. A lot to unpack with this budget. I'm looking forward to it.
I'm looking forward to it as well. And we are very, very lucky today to have a special guest, a research fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs. Please welcome Cian Hussey.
Thanks for having me on, Renee.
Great to see you again, Cian, behind the border wall in WA. Hopefully we'll actually be able to see you in person sometime in the future. And she is from the Australian Taxpayers Alliance, a great friend of the Institute of Public Affairs and Generation Liberty. And we are very lucky to have her on the show again as a special guest. Please welcome Emilie Dye.
Hello, Renee. Thank you so much for having me on today.
Really, really great to see you again and very keen for this discussion. So to kick things off, I thought I would just ask you all your first impressions of this budget, or as some people are calling it, the coronavirus budget. As we know, this is a big budget and it is an unprecedented budget. So I would like to just hear your initial thoughts. And I thought I would throw to you first, Cian.
Yeah, so a big budget. The biggest thing for us is that the government hasn't even tried to outline when we might ever see a budget surplus again, or when Australia might rid itself of all this government debt. So some modelling that we did, in the hours after the budget was released, found that we're not expecting a budget surplus until around 2046, and we're not expecting gross debt to be eliminated until 2080. And that's based on pretty optimistic assumptions of economic growth and fiscal management. So we're assuming that once the government returns a budget surplus in the mid-2040s, that they'll maintain pretty remarkable fiscal responsibility for the better part of 40 years, which is probably unlikely. So yeah, that's the biggest thing for me. And what's really a shame is that there's no message of hope here. There's no message of there's some way that we can address structural issues in the economy and encourage better economic growth to get us out of this. There's a few things like the JobMaker hiring credit, where the government is basically wagering against its own industrial relations settings by saying it's too expensive to hire people who are on unemployment benefits. So it's pretty disappointing that a Liberal government has delivered a budget with no hope and that doesn't actually emphasise Liberal values.
Yeah, I have to agree there, Cian. Unfortunately, I do not think that the Liberals can really make the claim these days that they are the better economic managers, even though I do probably think that Labor would have done a worse job. Emilie, this budget has brought forth some tax cuts, though, which are a little glimmer of hope. But overall, what are your opinions on this budget?
It's very mixed bag. I give it about a 50-50 rating. The tax cuts are great. They're shifting the bracket creep problem that we've seen in Australia for a very long time. As our salaries increase with inflation, the real spending power will decrease with inflation unless we increase salaries. And so automatically most employers will do that, slowly creeping up salaries to match the real spending. And as a result, people slowly creep into higher tax brackets, meaning they're taxed more even though their real income isn't anymore. We see this with like a minimum wage worker. Before this budget, they were creeping into the 32.5% tax bracket. That's ridiculous. So I think they did a very good job of correcting that by increasing those tax brackets. I would have liked to see more on the lower end, really increasing that upwards of $45,000 for the 32% tax bracket, but a step in the right direction for sure.
Yeah, I think there are some things in there that give us a little bit of glimmer of hope. But Peumike, you are a student, and young people have been some of the worst affected during some of these coronavirus changes and economic impacts. So what is your opinions on this budget?
Well, I had a very visceral reaction to the numbers at the beginning, like a $213 billion deficit, a $1 trillion debt, most likely going to balloon to $2 trillion in my lifetime. That's just insane. And it was quite heartbreaking, to be honest. As a young person, I'll be part of the generation which will bear the grunt of this burden. And I just wonder what could have been done better earlier in the year. And you couldn't point to a more obvious reason, right? It's the devastating toll on the economy is the disease. The excessive lockdowns were the cause. And that continues to be the problem here in Victoria. And for the budget in particular, whilst spending programs have their place, particularly in supporting young people who are the most vulnerable and who have been disproportionately the most affected, it was not the only way. And I think this government, but more particularly the actions of the state governments, have forced Frydenberg into this position. And perhaps the most frightening thing in all of this is that the budget forecasts are contingent on having pretty much all of Australia vaccinated by the end of next year. So we're in a very precarious situation, and I'm not sure that we have the hope there in this budget to really get out of this.
Yeah, it is a little bit worrying, especially, being so determined and so reliant on that vaccination coming through at the end of 2021. Ryan, you're also a student and you're also studying in an economics field. What was your initial reaction to this budget?
Ask me again in 5 years, I think is probably the short answer. I was really happy to see that there was more being spent on apprenticeships and on university support. I think that moving forward, that may be a faster route to rebuilding small businesses.
Yeah, I think that's a really solid point there. I think there are some glimmers of hope in this budget, but many of you may have read an article by Cian, which is in The Spectator, about the shocking numbers of debt that we have touched upon. And the modelling from the Institute of Public Affairs has shown that it could take till, as Cian said, till 2045 to 2046 for government to deliver a budget surplus. But even worse, total debt, we are not going to be getting rid of this debt till it looks like the 2080s. So I'll be lucky to still be alive in that period. So to really go back to that issue of this debt, Emilie, what are your thoughts on this kind of worrying future hanging over young people about paying off such a massive debt?
It's a huge amount of money. One thing we did at the ATA is we broke it down so you can actually see what this is costing the average person. So per person in Australia, the debt from this year is $28,000. That's almost a salary for a lot of people. It's a lot of money. And one thing that people don't realize is how the debt actually impacts them. As we're paying taxes, a percentage of that has to go to interest. And so it isn't going to any services that are benefiting us. It's just wasted. It's lost money. And so we have to pay more taxes to keep up with those increasing interest rates. And if you spent much time looking at compounding interest or borrowed money, it goes up very fast. And the US is in this situation right now where they have a huge debt and the interest is nearly as much as the military spending. It's astronomical. We could have a second military with the amount of money that we're spending on just interest. It's lost. So Australia really needs to avoid falling into that trap. And that requires some serious cuts. We can't keep spending like we're doing right now and expect to have a prosperous economy in the future.
Yeah, I think you've brought up some really good points there, but also bringing up comparisons from other countries. One of the arguments that we have seen from people about the debt is that, well, our debt's not that bad in comparison. There are other countries where their debt in relation to GDP is much higher. Peumike, what are your thoughts on that kind of thinking, trying to say that, well, it's not that bad if you compare us to other worse economic situations?
Well, that's like saying I'm not entirely healthy, but at least I don't have cancer, right? It's not a good situation to put yourself in the first place. And I just want to make this point. I know it looks quite daunting, and it's a lot to take on board, especially with all this debt around. But I think what we should be at least a little bit hopeful for is that, thank God, Labor aren't in power to have managed the situation federally right now. And it could have been even worse if you could imagine that. It kind of has to do with the points that Emilie was talking about. Now, I know what you're thinking. We have a $213 billion deficit. That sounds very much like a Labor budget. But believe me, Tuesday's budget is nothing like a Labor budget. Unlike a Labor budget whose deficit is the result of wasteful and excessive government spending, which is baked in to the policies and next to impossible to reverse. If we really see where primarily the deficit's coming from with this budget, it's the result of spending, sure, but that spending is quite temporary, hopefully. That's what we hope to be the case. But also the deficit is primarily thanks to generous tax cuts and relief towards small business with instant asset write-offs. In this sense, this is a deficit based, I know Cian was talking that it wasn't based off of liberal values, but I think it's somewhat based off of liberal values in the sense that we know that economic growth and prosperity is achieved when citizens have more of their own money in their pockets, which also helps boost aggregate demand as well. And that strong economy is driven by small business and the private sector and not big government. This is a budget that's tough, especially for fiscal conservatives. We might start doubting whether or not we're truly liberal or not with these policies. But it's one that was somewhat necessary to address the situation in front of us. We don't really want a jobless Australia. But to be honest, I'm just ashamed we arrived at this position. So going back to initially what you were talking about, you can't compare our situation to the much poorer situation in the United States. Well, we've been known to have a strong economy in the past liberal governments delivering an economy which is hopefully going to get back into the black very, very soon and then deliver a surplus. And then we don't see that, so it's quite disappointing. That being said, it's a budget for the times. It's a budget given the situations and decisions that were made earlier in the year. But thank God we don't have a socialist government in power right now to make the decisions.
Yeah, I think you've made some interesting points there, but I think I'll actually throw to Cian now. What are your thoughts on the comparison of where this deficit comes from? Is it mostly from those tax cuts, or do you think it's mostly coming from spending? And also in relation into the instant asset write-off, I know that the Institute of Public Affairs and also research that you've been doing has been asking for this for a while. Do you think that these moves by the government go far enough, and are they really going to help all businesses?
Well, the thing with the instant asset write-off and the accelerated depreciation is the problem with this budget, and why I'm saying we have a liberal government that won't pursue liberal values. They're not implementing this accelerated depreciation rather, because they're going to the first principles and saying private business drive economic growth, they drive the economy, they provide 85% of jobs, and we want to support them. They're saying, well, we want to shift investment forward. So they're implementing a temporary accelerated depreciation policy. If we were actually pursuing liberal values, they'd be making it permanent. So the IPA has been calling for accelerated depreciation to be made a permanent policy, because the evidence from around the world suggests that when you make it permanent, you increase wages, jobs, and investment in the long run. So that's what I mean by we're not pursuing liberal values here. And it's the same thing with the income tax cut. So if the government were going to the first principles, they'd be saying, we're cutting taxes because families and individuals know better how to spend their money than the government does. But instead, they're saying, well, we're in a recession and we need to stimulate the economy. We need to boost aggregate demand, and therefore we need to give people, there's two ways of basically giving out money, which is to spend it or to decrease what you take off people. So that's what I mean by liberal values. I don't think that the government is actually committed to saying those things, and they should come out and say it. They should say, we're reducing taxes because we believe in smaller government and we believe that people make better decisions than government. So while a lot of the deficit does come from tax cuts, it's temporary changes, and it doesn't really fix those structural issues. Quickly as well, on the point about small business, Australia has the second highest statutory tax rate in the OECD. The average in the OECD is around 23%, and ours is 30%. You can reduce your effective tax rate using things like accelerated depreciation. But the problem there is it becomes more available to businesses that are ready to invest and to businesses that can hire accountants that can get them these tax exemptions. For your average, small business or self-employed person who's running a small operation, they don't have access to this kind of stuff. So what we should be pursuing is lower corporate tax cuts that would apply to all businesses.
Yeah, I think that's some really strong points there, because, not all small businesses are also going to have the access to the accounting and the kind of backdoor ways or, difficult ways they could get some of these cuts. Is always going to advantage the big end of town and not necessarily the smaller businesses that really need the help right now. Ryan, I'd like to know your thoughts on Cian's comments that, some of these tax cuts are good and some of these movements are good, but they're not actually coming from, a principled statement from the government. And also what your thoughts are on how much worse this may be if we actually had a Labor government in place. Do you believe that to be the case?
I think it depends on whether or not you believe in modern monetary theory. I'm not a fan of debt in general, but I think what worries me more is a lot of the assumptions and foundations that go into the estimates. I think a lot of the time forecasting is a fool's game. I think we're probably better off trying to look at areas of fragility that have been exposed during COVID and trying to remedy those moving forward. In regards to the tax cuts, I think I would agree with Cian. I don't think I have anything else sort of useful to add to what he said, unfortunately.
That's all good. So what we've established, unfortunately, really is that Australians are going to be paying for these lockdowns over their lifetime, especially young people who have also suffered disproportionately from job losses and across the board economically. Meanwhile, one of the things that's really seems unfair, especially to most Australians, I think, is that the public sector has continued to grow. And we've also seen, things like the ABC still asking for a pay rise during this time. So there has been comments that, by many people right now, that the new kind of class divide is actually perhaps between the private sector and the public sector going into the future. So Ryan, what are your thoughts on that? That there is this growing divide between those who work on a government paycheck and people who work in the private sector?
My mind immediately goes to John Maynard Keynes. You're talking about how the government would be better off paying people to dig holes and fill them in than to just be giving them welfare. I don't know if the extra hiring in the public service is some small attempt to do something like that. And I don't know if I don't know if I know enough immediately to be able to comment further without any authority.
Okay. And Cian, what are your thoughts on the continued growth of the public sector during this time?
It's pretty shocking, and it's a betrayal of mainstream Australians who are suffering in the private sector. So we're calling this Australia's K-shaped recession. So in a normal recession, everything kind of goes down and goes back up again. But what we've seen here is the public sector on the upwards arm of the K, because they continue to grow, receive pay increases, and the public sector has expanded. And meanwhile, the private sector is on the downward arm of the K, and they're suffering. So according to Australian Bureau of Statistics data, since the 14th of March, around 20,000 new public sector workers have been hired. And this doesn't include nurses and teachers. This is the bureaucrats. And 600,000 private sector workers have lost their job. So for every new public sector worker hired, 30 Australians working in the private sector have lost theirs. And it's not just about jobs as well. It's about wages and the stress that puts on households. So ABS data, the national accounts for the June quarter, shows that in the June quarter alone, private sector wages decreased by $5.9 billion and public sector wages increased by $768 million. So I think you're absolutely right. This is the new class divide we've got this protected class of bureaucrats in the public sector who haven't suffered any consequences of the lockdowns, economically speaking anyway. And then you have mainstream Australians in the private sector who've been hammered. And I think as well, there's a serious moral hazard issue here, because it's those who work in the public sector who decide how and when lockdown measures are lifted, and they're not impacted by it. They have no skin in the game. So yeah, it's very concerning. And yeah, this K-shaped recession, it's only going to compound the differences between this class of elites and mainstream Australians.
Yeah, I really agree there. And I think it's really worrying, because there is this kind of comment that we keep hearing that this is unprecedented and comments like that. And yes, this is a unique crisis in Australia, but Australia has got through things like this before, and we have done it actually with fiscal conservatism. I actually was infuriated watching, I think it was Channel 7 News, and ScoMo saying that he was looking to Joseph Lyons and looking to a past Prime Minister, Joseph Lyons, for inspiration for this next budget. And I think he mustn't have looked at what Joseph Lyons did very carefully, because this was the Prime Minister who got us through to the Depression. And unlike what we are seeing now, we got through the Depression in the past actually through fiscal conservatism, through making massive cuts, including to the public sector. And it was actually an economic marvel at the time. Countries around the world called it the Australian model, and we were actually, seen as the way to go forward if you were going to get out of a depression really quickly. And Australia bounced back much faster than most countries. And it's actually a forgotten part of our history that I think people should be touching on more. So it's even more infuriating when, ScoMo says, I'm going to look to this past, and then doesn't actually pay attention to what got us through it at all. So Peumike, what are your thoughts on maybe what I've just said, but also what I was touching on about this new class divide, about the private sector and the public sector?
Yeah, well, I don't have too much above and beyond what Key and Ryan were talking about, so I'll keep my response very short. But the K-shaped recovery that we're seeing right now, it's not only inherently wrong, but it shows a complete lack of appreciation to what really has driven the Australian economy for decades and has made us one of the most wealthiest nations on earth. And I guess this goes without saying, but never bite the hand that feeds you. And for us Australians, that hand has been the private sector. It will hopefully continue to be the private sector, and we should be showing it a lot more respect than it's been shown at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And also kind of touching on that, what I was mentioning, that historical context, I think it can get really frustrating. And Emilie, you may have thoughts on this as someone from the United States. This continued kind of myth throughout history that Keynesianism is what kind of saved America from, the Great Depression, and, the New Deal and everything like that is how to deal with economic slumps and the Depression. Why do you think that this myth always has it's hard to kill, and especially when, at the time, the countries that were using fiscal conservatism got out of it faster. So it just seems that facts don't matter with this myth continuing to be perpetuated.
Yes, I've definitely seen that with this budget. It's very much an FDR style, shovel-ready jobs type of budget. They're trying to create these jobs, and it looks nice on paper. It's really easy to count bureaucrats. It's really easy to count public sector jobs that have been created. But it's very hard to see all of the jobs here and there that have been lost because a business has high taxes and they're not able to hire that one more employee. And that's spread across the economy. And ultimately, there's more loss from those high taxes. But the government can look at a pretty number and be like, oh, look, we created this many jobs. They're not looking at both sides of that equation. I also think there's this myth that's going around, and I keep hearing it. People keep asking me, well, if we cut taxes, people won't spend that money, and we can't have people saving that money. But that's not a problem if people save money. We don't live in an era where we hide the money under our mattresses anymore. We're not digging holes and on the beach and hiding them in treasure chests to mark with an X. That money is still in circulation. So when you're saving your money, you're putting it in a bank. That bank is lending it out to a business that could be struggling as a result of COVID-19. It doesn't look like that immediate payoff that we see, but that money is still in circulation. It's not lost in the transaction costs that go through the government. So when the government's taking out taxes, in order to hire those employees, they're also losing a lot of that money, probably more so than when a person just saves that money and that gets lent out to a business that helps them survive, keeps their employees on for longer through the crisis.
Yeah, I agree there, but speak for yourself. I may have some money stashed under my bed as well.
Not my Bitcoin.
But don't tell the tax office. But I also find it ironic that people are so worried about people saving money, but then one of the other points that always comes up with young people is how home ownership and how you're going to get a house. Well, the only way for more young people to get homes is to save, and one of the best ways to allow them to save is to let them to keep more of their money going into the future. But the final question I'm going to throw to all of you, which is, if you were treasurer, what would you have done differently? I would maybe say keep it to one particular issue or reform that you think was really missing or really could have made a big difference. So we'll start with you, Peumike.
If I were to choose one, would probably have to be greater company tax cuts for me. Australia has something like the second highest company tax cuts amongst developed nations, and it's about time that's changed, especially if you want to stimulate the economy. Now's the perfect time to do so. So greater company tax cuts. Frydenberg, get on it.
Yeah, I have to agree there. And Ryan, what would you do if you were treasurer?
I think first and foremost, a voluntary salary sacrifice for himself. But maybe while delivering the budget, he should have announced the same for all of the MPs and senators and just not told them and see what happens.
Yeah, I quite like that. A voluntary sacrifice sounds quite nice as well. It feels apt for the times as we keep talking about, doomsday and such like things like that. Yes, I quite like that. And Emilie, what would you do if you were treasurer?
I like that idea of the sacrifice, but you should have heard all of the public sector employees whining about only getting a 0.3% raise. I also would cut the corporate tax rate. It is way too high, and as a result, it hits small businesses. People like to think of the 30% corporate tax rate hitting the really big multinational companies, but it really doesn't. Netflix Australia pays taxes in the Netherlands because they have a lower corporate tax rate. So it's just hurting our small businesses right here in Australia, and the big businesses are getting away with not paying taxes. If we had a lower corporate tax rate, those businesses would be attracted to Australia, much like they're attracted to other tax havens internationally. And that would benefit the economy as a whole, would it create jobs, and would also lower the debt as they then pay a lower tax rate, but they're still paying taxes.
Yes, I definitely think that is an incredibly good point. And we'll go to Cian last. Cian, if you were treasurer for the day or for this budget, what would you have done differently?
Definitely would have brought forward the stage 3 income taxes as well, and ideally backdated them to July as well. They've already been voted for by the Australian people at the last election. They've already been legislated. If the government believes in them and thinks that they're the right thing to do, then they should just implement them.
Yeah, I think I'll have to agree with that because I can always get behind some tax cuts. I think Milton Friedman said, I support cutting taxes at any time and for any reason. And I think that still is relevant today. But now we are going to move on to one of our favorite segments on the show, which always gets a little bit heated, which is The Price is Right with government spending. So we're going to begin with a little bit of arts funding. So this question is, since April, the Australian Council of Arts has dished out a huge amount of taxpayers' money on the Emergency Reliance Fund to a range of artists clearly obsessed with identity politics. So how much money has the council given away in these projects? Okay, Cian, this actually was research done by someone within the office, so you may have a slight advantage, but we'll start with you.
I think it was it $7.6 million?
Okay, we will start with 7.6. So this is the closest without going over. Peumike, we'll go to you.
Well, was it Dr. Bella DeBera who did that? Yeah. Oh, got it. Kian, what did you say, Kian? What was your prediction?
7.6 million.
7.6 million. I'll go just a bit higher, 7.7.
Okay, Emilie?
I'm going to jump it up to 8.
8 million. And Ryan?
I feel like for some reason it was lower, but I'm probably wrong. 7, shift flat 7.
Unfortunately, Kian did have too much of an advantage of this, and it was actually $7.6 million. So maybe I should go to him last. Okay. And another example of crazy spending. How much did the federal government actually pay earlier this year to upgrade a Bridgeside North Sydney pool? So we'll start with Emilie this time.
I mean, considering the fact that they managed to spend 1.2 million on indoor plants, at some point, I'm going to go with something stupid. Let's go with, I'll just do 1.2. We'll see what happens with that.
Okay, 1.2 by Emilie. Okay, Ryan, what would you say they spent on this North Sydney pool?
Too much. 3.5.
Okay, 3.5 million. And Peumike, how much would you estimate they spent on this pool?
I'll go 3 million.
Oh, that's 3 million. You don't want to change. Oh, 3.5 and 3. Okay, that's fine. Yeah, actually. And then Cian, what would you say?
Go somewhere in the middle. I'll say 2 million.
Well, none of you were pessimistic enough. They actually spent $10 million on this pool. So I think, Ryan, you get the points there. Were you the closest with 3.5?
I deserve it, but yes. Yeah.
Still not close enough. They spent $10 million on a pool. So it better be a bloody nice pool.
Like gold tiles.
Yeah. Okay. In 2018, the government bought land near Western Sydney Airport for a huge sum of money. Recently, it was uncovered that the land was actually only worth $3 million. How much did the government actually pay for the land? We'll start with you, Emilie.
Well, I read this, so I should know it. It was like over double. I know that. I'm going to go with 6.
Okay, 6 million. Peumike, how much are you going to go for? How much did they pay for this land that was only worth $3 million?
10 million.
Okay, 10 million. Ryan, how much did they pay for this land that was only worth 3 million?
8.
8. And Cian, what is your estimate?
I can't remember exactly, but it was just under 30. So I think I'll go with 29 million.
Dan, you are on the money. It's $29.8 million.
Yeah.
So almost 10 times the price that it was actually worth. So your taxpayers' dollars definitely been spent well there. So last time we actually had Emilie on the show, we discussed pedestal taxes or toilet taxes. We discovered a new one in Townsville where for every extra toilet, there is a charge. Rate per toilet. How much is this tax per toilet? And I'll give you a range. It's under 5,000. So like just to give you some range, so you don't go astronomical. So we'll start with you, Cian. How much do they have to pay per toilet?
3,400.
Okay, and Peumike?
A bit more pessimistic, 4,000.
Ryan?
1,500.
Okay, and Emilie?
I'm gonna go with 1,000.
You are right, Emilie. It's close. It's $945 per toilet. Okay, and this is not technically a numbers question, but I'll throw this in as the last question. I think we've got Emilie on 1, Cian on 2, and Ryan on 1. But which MP embarrassingly tweeted that the new tax rates would be the same for 2 earning rates? So first off, I want her name. So I'll get you to buzz in for the name. Does anyone know?
Stupid favorite.
I commented on this tweet. I should know her name.
Okay, well, I'll give you the name. Her name is Joanne Ryan, but the guess I'll get you. What were the two incomes that she said would be taxed at the same rate?
Peumike,
Yeah.
was it 45,000 and 200,000?
120, I think.
120,000.
Okay. So we've kind of got that as a group. I don't know who will get the points, but I think Cian takes away today as he got two answers right. So congratulations on winning the prices right with government spending. I'm sure this will eventually make its way to some primetime television one day, hopefully.
It'd be like the next game show.
Yeah. I wanted to do it at Friedman actually when we still were going to do it live. And then we could have had people running down screaming when they were chosen like the proper prices right. So that would have been
that'd
fun.
be great.
Okay, well, that was definitely a fun game to end on. And I would definitely like to thank my amazing guests for our special budget episode of Viral Banter. Cian, Peumike, Emilie, and Ryan, thank you for your time today.
Thanks, Renee.
Thank you so much.
And if you are not a member of Generation Liberty yet, what are you doing? You can join at generationliberty.org.au for only $10 and you will get an awesome welcome pack with books, stickers, bottle openers, and all things Liberty, which is worth way more than $10, and also updates on upcoming events. Yes, we are starting to have events again, which is very exciting in everywhere except Dictator Dan's Victoria. And also all the updates on this show and everything that the IPA is putting out on the podcast network. Emilie, I'll throw to you to give them, the audience, a little bit of information on how they can find out about the Australian Taxpayers Alliance.
Yes, if you look up the Australian Taxpayers Alliance, you can find us on our website. We have a membership program as well, and I believe we also have some good stickers. And you can sign up there. It's a monthly membership, and yeah, just find us online.
Thank you for that, Emilie. And thank you everyone for listening to all the Generation Liberty members and soon to be Generation Liberty's members. We really appreciate your feedback on this show and the great viewership that we are getting. But for now, make sure that you stay curious, stay happy, and stay free.